Chapter 1. Born in violence in the central plains of Iraq, near the ancient town of Tikrit, lies a small and impoverished village called Al-Awja. In the late 1930s, Al-Awja was a harsh place to grow up. The soil was dry, dust storms swept across the flat land, and the people lived in mud brick huts without running water, electricity, or basic medical care. Life was driven by old tribal rules, poverty, and a daily struggle for survival. It was in this village, on April 28, 1937, that a boy named Saddam Hussein al-Majid was born into a world defined by hardship, loss, and conflict. Saddam's life was marked by tragedy even before he drew his first breath. Months before his birth, his father, Hussein Abd al-Majid, disappeared from the village. Some local accounts suggested he was killed by bandits. Others claimed he simply abandoned his family or died of illness. Before the family could process this loss, Saddam's 12-year-old older brother died of cancer. These sudden deaths devastated his mother, Subha Tulfa al-Musalat. Overwhelmed by grief, poverty, and severe depression while pregnant with Saddam, Subha attempted to end her own pregnancy and even tried to commit suicide. A local Jewish family intervened to protect her and ensure the child was brought into the world safely. When the boy was born, Subha named him Saddam, an Arabic name meaning one who confronts or he who strikes hard. Unable and unwilling to care for her newborn baby due to her deep grief, Subha refused to hold Saddam. Seeing the child in danger, his maternal uncle, Kar-Ala Tulfa, stepped in. Kar-Ala was an army officer and an ardent Arab nationalist who lived in the nearby town of Tikrit. He took the infant Saddam into his home, where Kar-Ala's wife nursed the boy alongside their own children. For the first 3 years of his life, Saddam lived relatively peacefully in Tikrit, raised by his uncle's family. However, this period of stability did not last long. In 1941, political upheaval changed the course of Saddam's early childhood. Kar-Ala Tulfa participated in an anti-British military uprising led by nationalist officers in Baghdad. The British military quickly crushed the rebellion, reasserted control over Iraq, and arrested the rebellious officers. Kar-Ala was dismissed from the military and sentenced to 5 years in prison. With Kar-Ala behind bars, Saddam had to be sent back to his mother in Al-Awja. Back in Al-Awja, Subha had remarried. Her new husband was Ibrahim al-Hassan, Hussein Abd al-Majid's brother. According to local custom, a widow often married her late husband's brother to keep the family together. But Ibrahim al-Hassan was a cruel, ignorant, and violent man. Known around the village by the nickname Ibrahim the Liar, he treated young Saddam not as a son, but as an unwanted burden and a servant. The years Saddam spent under Ibrahim's roof were filled with fear and physical cruelty. Ibrahim forced Saddam to wake up before dawn to tend to the family's sheep and goats. He routinely beat Saddam with a thick wooden stick embedded with asphalt, often hitting him for no reason at all. Ibrahim refused to allow Saddam to attend school, believing that reading and writing were useless skills for a peasant boy. Instead, he forced Saddam to steal crops, melons, and livestock from neighboring farms. If Saddam returned empty-handed, he was severely beaten and denied food. This abuse left deep marks on the young boy's mind. Saddam learned early on that the world was a hostile place where no one was safe, trust was dangerous, and power was the only protection against suffering. He became an outcast among the children of Al-Awja. Because he was fatherless and wore dirty, ragged clothes, other boys mocked him and called him names. Saddam did not respond with tears or withdrawal. Instead, he reacted with anger and aggression. He began carrying an iron rod wrapped in cloth to defend himself from other children and stray dogs. When insulted, he would strike without hesitation. He learned that fear was a tool that could keep people from hurting him. Life in Al-Awja continued this way until 1947, when Saddam was 10 years old. His maternal uncle, Kar al-Tulfa, was finally released from prison and returned to live in Tikrit. When Kar al visited Al-Awja, Saddam saw a path out of his misery. His cousin, Kar al's son Adnan, was learning to read and write in Tikrit. Saddam felt a fierce desire to learn as well. He realized that education was his only chance to escape the poverty of the mud huts and the beatings of his stepfather. When Ibrahim al-Hassan flatly refused to let Saddam go to school, Saddam made a dangerous decision. Late one night, 10-year-old Saddam snuck out of his stepfather's house in the dark, carrying nothing with him, and ran away into the countryside. He walked miles across the desert terrain until he reached Tikrit, arriving at his uncle Kar al's doorstep. Impressed by the boy's determination and courage, Kar al took him in once again and enrolled him in the local primary school. Moving to Tikrit was the pivotal turning point of Saddam's young life. Kar al-Tulfa was far more than just a guardian. He became Saddam's surrogate father, mentor, and ideological guide. Kar al was a deeply proud man, consumed by bitterness over his court-martial and imprisonment by the British-backed Iraqi government. He filled his home with stories of Arab heroism, military history, and political grievances. Kar al introduced Saddam to the legacy of great Arab figures, especially Saladin, the legendary Muslim military leader who defeated the Crusaders in the 12th century. Saladin had also been born near Tikrit. Kar al constantly reminded Saddam that people from Tikrit were destined for greatness and leadership. At the same time, Kar al taught his nephew a deeply paranoid and intolerant worldview. He believed that Iraq was surrounded by enemies, foreign imperialists, religious minorities, and neighboring nations like Iran. Kar al would later write an infamous pamphlet titled "Three Whom God Should Not Have Created: Persians, Jews, and Flies." This intense blend of Arab pride, anti-Western hostility, historical myth, and absolute prejudice deeply shaped Saddam's growing ambition and worldview. In Tikrit, Saddam proved to be an eager student. Although he started primary school several years older than his classmates, he worked hard to catch up. He was quiet, proud, and quick to take offense if he felt disrespected. His uncle taught him strict military discipline, self-reliance, and the importance of family loyalty. Kar al's house was a meeting place for local nationalists, political dissidents, and men who hated the Hashemite monarchy ruling Iraq. By the mid-1950s, Iraq was experiencing massive political unrest. The country was ruled by King Faisal Roman II and his prime minister, Nuri al-Said, who maintained close ties with Great Britain. To many young Iraqis, the monarchy appeared corrupt, weak, and subservient to foreign oil companies and Western governments. At the same time, the idea of pan-Arabism, the unification of all Arab nations into one powerful state, was spreading rapidly across the Middle East, driven by the charismatic Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. In 1955, at the age of 18, Saddam moved with Kar al's family to Baghdad, the capital of Iraq. They settled in the working-class neighborhood of Al-Kark. Saddam enrolled at Al-Kark High School, a well-known center for student activism, political radicalism, and street protests. Baghdad was a boiling pot of competing political movements. Communists, traditional nationalists, Islamists, and pan-Arabists all fought for influence among the youth. Saddam was drawn to the most radical nationalist groups. In 1957, at 20 years old, he joined the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party, whose name means Renaissance or Resurrection, was a small, secretive political organization at the time. Its slogan was unity, freedom, socialism. The party advocated for the creation of a single, unified Arab state free from Western influence, governed by a strong central leadership. Unlike many intellectuals in the Ba'ath Party who debated political theory in cafes, Saddam was drawn to the action on the streets. He was tall, physically imposing, and fearless. He volunteered for the party's enforcement squads, groups of young men who protected party meetings, broke up rival political gatherings, and fought with rival gangs and police in the streets of Baghdad. During this time, Saddam committed his first acts of political violence. Back in Tikrit, a local government official was murdered. The official was an ally of the monarchy and had reported Kar al-Tulfa to the authorities. Saddam was arrested as a primary suspect in the killing, although there was not enough evidence to convict him, and he was eventually released after 6 months in prison. The incident cemented his reputation within the Ba'ath Party. He was no longer just a high school student or a street organizer. He was a man who was willing to use blood and violence to settle political and personal scores. By the end of the 1950s, the political climate in Iraq was reaching a boiling point. In July 1958, a violent military coup led by Brigadier General Abd al-Karim Qasim overthrew the Hashemite monarchy. King Faisal Roman II, his family, and Prime Minister Nuri al-Said were brutally killed in the streets of Baghdad. The monarchy was destroyed, and Iraq was declared a republic. The 1958 revolution opened a new chapter of instability and conflict in Iraq. The Ba'ath Party initially supported the revolution, expecting Qasim to align Iraq with Gamal Abdel Nasser's Pan-Arab movement. However, once in power, Qasim refused to join the United Arab Republic and instead partnered with the Iraqi Communist Party to consolidate his hold on the country. This decision turned the Ba'athists into Qasim's fierce enemies. For Saddam Hussein, the chaotic world of post-monarchy Baghdad was the perfect environment to thrive. The boy from Al-Audja, who had survived childhood neglect, brutal beatings, and poverty through sheer toughness and aggression, now found a purpose for his hostility. His harsh early life had taught him that the world was ruled by force, that weakness was fatal, and that power belonged to those who were willing to strike first. As Iraq entered a new era of violent political struggles, Saddam stood ready to act as a revolutionary apprentice, prepared to use any means necessary to climb the ladder of political power. The 1958 revolution had shattered Iraq's ancient political order, but the peace that followed was short-lived. General Abd al-Karim Qasim's refusal to join the Pan-Arab Union pushed the Ba'ath Party into open rebellion. For 21-year-old Saddam Hussein, street fighting and political rhetoric were no longer enough. He sought a central role in the violent struggle for control of Iraq, eager to prove his absolute loyalty to the party and demonstrate his capacity for ruthless action. By 1959, the Ba'ath Party leadership had concluded that Qasim could not be removed through peaceful political pressure or military plotting alone. The solution was simple and deadly: assassination. The party began organizing a secret hit squad to eliminate Qasim as his motorcade traveled along Al-Rashid Street, one of Baghdad's busiest thoroughfares. Saddam was not a high-ranking political strategist within the party, but his reputation for raw physical toughness and fearlessness made him an ideal candidate for the operational cell. When the party called for volunteers to carry out the dangerous mission, Saddam immediately put his name forward. On the afternoon of October 7, 1959, Saddam and 5 other young Ba'athist militants took their positions along Al-Rashid Street. They hid automatic weapons under their long coats and waited for Qasim's station wagon to appear. The plan called for a disciplined, synchronized crossfire that would instantly neutralize the Prime Minister's security detail and guarantee his death. However, when Qasim's car finally approached, panic and amateurism ruined the coordination. Saddam, fueled by adrenaline and eager to secure the credit for the killing, broke protocol and opened fire prematurely. He stepped into the open street and unleashed a burst of submachine gun fire toward the vehicle. The premature ambush threw the rest of the hit squad into chaos. Instead of a controlled crossfire, a messy and chaotic gun battle erupted in the middle of daytime traffic. Qasim's driver was killed instantly, and Qasim himself was struck several times, falling to the floorboards of the car to take cover. Qasim survived the assault with non-fatal wounds. In the wild exchange of gunfire between the assassins, Qasim's bodyguards, and even between the hit squad members themselves, one of the Ba'athist shooters was killed, and Saddam was hit in the leg by a stray bullet. Realizing the assassination had failed, the surviving members of the squad scattered into the crowded alleys of Baghdad. Bleeding heavily from his leg wound, Saddam managed to reach a safe house controlled by the Ba'ath Party. Local party members provided basic medical care, but the bullet remained lodged deep in his leg. According to later Ba'athist propaganda, Saddam used a pocket knife to cut the bullet out of his own leg without any anesthesia. While party mythmakers heavily exaggerated this story in later decades to portray him as a superhuman warrior, the reality was that Saddam was a wounded, hunted fugitive facing execution if captured by Qasim's police forces. With Baghdad under lockdown and police raiding suspected Ba'athist hideouts across the capital, Saddam needed to leave Iraq immediately. Disguised as a Bedouin tribesman and riding a motorcycle, he fled Baghdad and headed north toward the Syrian border. The journey across the harsh, arid desert was long and dangerous. Syrian authorities, who supported the Pan-Arab movement and opposed Qasim's government, welcomed the wounded young assassin. In Damascus, Saddam found temporary shelter, medical treatment, and his first exposure to the broader international network of the Ba'ath Party. Damascus in 1950 was the intellectual heart of the Ba'athist movement. Here, Saddam met Mitchell Aflaq, the Syrian philosopher and co-founder of the party. Aflaq was an intellectual idealist who spoke of Arab rebirth, secular nationalism, and moral renewal. Saddam, however, brought a very different perspective to the party. He cared little for abstract political philosophy. His focus was entirely on organizational discipline, covert action, and the practical application of power. Aflaq saw in the tough, unyielding young Iraqi a useful operator who could enforce party discipline and lead street-level operations. Saddam's failed attempt on Qasim's life, rather than being treated as a tactical blunder, was transformed by party leaders into a heroic tale of bravery. Saddam was elevated to a prominent position within the party's youth wing. After spending several months in Damascus, Saddam moved to Cairo, Egypt, in 1960. Cairo was the vibrant political capital of the Arab world, dominated by the towering figure of Gamal Abdel Nasser. For Saddam, his time in Cairo was an intense learning period. He enrolled at Cairo University to study law, but his true focus remained political activism. He spent his days in the city's historic cafes, debating politics with other exiled Iraqi students, organizing Ba'athist cells, and observing how President Nasser maintained control over Egyptian society. In Cairo, Saddam carefully studied Nasser's state machinery. He was fascinated by how Nasser used propaganda, a single-party political system, and an extensive intelligence network to control the public and neutralize political rivals. Saddam began to formulate his own ideas about governance. Political ideology was a useful tool to motivate the masses, but real control required absolute centralization of security forces and secret police. During his exile, Saddam grew increasingly cold, patient, and calculating. He recognized that rash, uncoordinated actions like the 1959 assassination attempt were dangerous failures. If he wanted to seize and hold power, he needed to build a disciplined, secretive organization capable of operating completely in the shadows. While Saddam was studying and organizing in Cairo, the political situation in Iraq continued to deteriorate. General Qassem's regime grew increasingly isolated. Qassem alienated the military officer corps, fought a disastrous war against Kurdish rebels in northern Iraq, and broke ties with both the communists and the pan-Arabists. By early 1963, a coalition of nationalist military officers and Ba'athist conspirators prepared to strike. On February 8, 1963, a bloody military coup known as the Ramadan Revolution overthrew Qassem's government. Ba'athist military officers stormed the presidential palace in Baghdad. After a short and violent siege, Qassem was captured, subjected to a brief mock trial, and executed on live national television. The Ba'ath Party had finally seized power in Iraq, establishing a new government led by President Abdul Salam Arif, a nationalist officer, and Prime Minister Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, a senior Ba'athist figure, and a distant relative of Saddam from Tikrit. Upon hearing the news of the successful coup, Saddam immediately packed his belongings and returned to Baghdad after more than 3 years in exile. The 25-year-old returned not as a minor street fighter, but as a seasoned revolutionary operator with strong connections to key party leaders. Iraq in 1963 was engulfed in violence. The new Ba'athist regime launched a brutal campaign to purge communists, Qassem loyalists, and left-wing dissidents from Iraqi society. To carry out this repression, the Ba'ath Party established a feared paramilitary force called the National Guard, al-Haraz al-Qawmi. Saddam quickly integrated himself into the operational leadership of this security apparatus. Armed with lists of political suspects, the National Guard terrorized Baghdad, carrying out mass arrests, torture, and extrajudicial executions. Detainees were taken to makeshift interrogation centers, the most notorious being the Qasr al-Nihaya, Palace of Endings, a former royal palace converted into a prison. In these basement interrogation rooms, Saddam actively participated in the interrogation and physical abuse of political prisoners. This period allowed him to perfect his methods of political intimidation and gain first-hand experience in using state terror as an administrative tool. However, the Ba'ath Party's first taste of power was violent and brief. The extreme violence of the National Guard, combined with intense internal rivalries within the party, alienated the public and alarmed senior military officers. President Abdul Salam Arif, who was not a Ba'athist himself, decided to take action against the party. In November 1963, just 9 months after taking power, President Arif used the regular Iraqi army to crack down on the National Guard, arrest key Ba'athist leaders, and oust the Ba'ath Party from the government. Once again, the Ba'ath Party was forced underground, and Saddam found himself hunted by state authorities. But unlike the chaotic aftermath of the 1959 failure, Saddam did not flee the country this time. He recognized that the party's downfall was caused by internal disorganization, factional fighting, and a lack of a dedicated internal security organ. He set out to rebuild the party from within the underground network in Baghdad. Working closely with his relative, Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, Saddam began restructuring the collapsed party apparatus. He argued that the Ba'ath Party could never rely solely on military officers to hold power, as officers were prone to switching loyalties. Instead, the party needed its own dedicated, highly secret security force, an organization that would monitor party members for disloyalty, gather intelligence on rival political groups, and prepare for a permanent takeover of the state. In 1964, al-Bakr and Saddam created a secret internal intelligence unit within the party called the Jihaz al-Qaz, the special apparatus, later known as Jihaz al-Hanin, the apparatus of yearning. Saddam was placed in direct control of this secret organization. Under his direction, the apparatus operated with absolute secrecy and discipline. It recruited tough, fiercely loyal young men, mostly from Saddam's home region of Tikrit and the surrounding sunny heartland. Saddam personally supervised the training of these operatives, instilling in them a culture of absolute obedience, surveillance, and ruthlessness. Saddam's growing influence inside the underground party did not go unnoticed by the Iraqi government. In October 1964, police discovered a secret Ba'athist hideout in Baghdad, and Saddam was arrested. He was sent to a high-security prison in Baghdad, where he would spend the next 2 years. Yet, imprisonment did not stop his political ascent. It provided him with a controlled environment to expand his influence. Inside prison, Saddam proved to be a master manipulator. He used smuggled letters and secret visits to maintain daily communication with al-Bakr and control the operations of the party's underground network. He projected an image of composure and strength, earning the respect of fellow political prisoners. Recognizing Saddam's organizational talent and unwavering determination, Mitchell Aflaq and the international Ba'ath leadership formally elected Saddam to the party's national command while he was still behind bars, making him the Assistant General Secretary of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party. During his time in prison, Saddam focused heavily on self-education. He read extensively about history, military strategy, and biographies of totalitarian leaders, including Joseph Stalin. Saddam deeply admired Stalin's methodical approach to building a police state, his total control over the party apparatus, and his willingness to eliminate real and imagined rivals. Saddam understood that real power did not rest in holding public titles or delivering passionate speeches. It lay in control of the party's administrative records, personnel files, and security apparatus. In July 1966, Saddam decided it was time to leave prison. With the help of Ba'athist conspirators on the outside, he engineered a smooth escape. While being transported under guard to a court hearing in central Baghdad, Saddam asked to use the restroom at a local restaurant. He slipped out of a side window, joined an awaiting vehicle driven by party associates, and vanished into the city's underground safe houses. Now a free man operating in secret, Saddam worked tirelessly alongside Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr to prepare for the party's return to power. The political climate in Iraq was once again shifting in their favor. President Abdul Salam Arif had died in a helicopter crash in 1966, and his brother, Abdul Rahman Arif, took over the presidency. The new president was seen as weak, indecisive, and incapable of managing Iraq's growing economic troubles and military frustration following the Arab defeat in the 1967 Six-Day War with Israel. Saddam spent the late 1960s methodically infiltrating key institutions in Baghdad. Through the Jihaz al-Hanin, he established secret contacts within the military, the Presidential Guard, and civil government ministries. He built a complex web of informants, collected blackmail material on political figures, and identified which military officers could be bought or intimidated. He ensured that, when the next opportunity arose, the Ba'ath Party would not make the same mistakes it made in 1963. By mid-1968, Iraq was ripe for another change of government. Saddam and al-Bakr formed a temporary tactical alliance with senior military intelligence officers inside President Arif's government, including Colonel Abd ar-Razak al-Nayef and General Ibrahim al-Dayyad. These officers held key positions in the presidential palace and were willing to turn against President Arif in exchange for high government positions in a new administration. On the night of July 17, 1968, the Ba'ath Party launched its final, decisive coup. Armed Ba'athist units, led personally by Saddam Hussein wearing a military uniform, drove tanks into the presidential palace compound in Baghdad. President Abdul Rahman Arif surrendered without a fight and was immediately placed on a plane to exile in London. The coup was executed cleanly, quickly, and without significant bloodshed. However, Saddam had no intention of sharing power with the military officers who had helped them carry out the takeover. He knew that non-Ba'athist officers like al-Nayef and al-Dayyad were potential threats who could easily overthrow the party later. Just 13 days after the initial coup, on July 30, 1968, Saddam executed a swift internal purge. While Colonel al-Nayef was attending a meeting inside the presidential palace, Saddam personally entered the room, pulled a gun on him, and informed him that his time in power was over. Escorted at gunpoint by Saddam's loyalists, al-Nayef was forced onto a plane and sent into exile. General al-Dayyad, who was out of the country inspecting troops in Jordan, was stripped of his command and barred from returning to Iraq. In less than 2 weeks, the Ba'ath Party had eliminated its coalition partners and secured absolute political dominance over Iraq. At 31 years old, the young man who had fled Al-Awja in dirty clothes and survived a failed assassination attempt on Al-Rashid Street was now the vice chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, the second most powerful man in the Iraqi state. His cousin and mentor, Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, assumed the presidency, serving as the respected elder figurehead of the regime. But behind the scenes, it was Saddam Hussein who held the real levers of authority. He was the master architect of the party's secret police, the builder of its internal security networks, and the shadow operator who controlled the fate of the nation. Saddam's long period as a revolutionary apprentice was over. His era of ruthless state building had begun. The July 1968 coup established the Ba'ath Party at the head of the Iraqi government. But Saddam Hussein understood that seizing power was only the first step. The party had held power briefly in 1963, only to lose it 9 months later, because of internal fighting and military interference. Saddam was determined to ensure that history did not repeat itself. While President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr served as the public face of the government, reassuring the traditional military officers, tribal leaders, and foreign diplomats, Saddam focused his energy on building an internal security network that would protect the regime from all internal and external threats. At 31 years old, holding the title of vice chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, Saddam began transforming the Ba'ath Party's secret intelligence unit, the Jihaz al-Hanin, into a massive state security organ. He took over physical facilities across Baghdad and converted them into intelligence offices, detention centers, and interrogation rooms. The core of this new security apparatus was recruited not from the general population, but from Saddam's home district of Tikrit and the surrounding sunny Arab heartland. He relied heavily on tribal connections and family ties, placing brothers, cousins, and close loyalists in key operational positions. This guaranteed that the security forces shared his absolute drive for self-preservation. One of Saddam's first major projects was the creation of the Maktab al-Malumat, the Information Bureau, which soon evolved into the General Intelligence Directorate, Jihaz al-Mukhabarat al-Amma. Unlike traditional military intelligence agencies, the Mukhabarat was designed to monitor every layer of Iraqi society, including the civilian bureaucracy, educational institutions, trade unions, and even the military itself. Informants were recruited in every neighborhood, workplace, and university. Citizens were encouraged to report on neighbors, co-workers, and family members who expressed criticism of the government or showed lack of enthusiasm for Ba'athist ideology. To solidify the regime's control and eliminate potential counter-revolutionary forces, Saddam organized a series of public purges aimed at creating an atmosphere of fear. In late 1968 and early 1969, the regime claimed to have uncovered widespread espionage networks working for Israel, the United States, and rival Arab states. Scores of military officers, civil servants, political figures, and civilian citizens were arrested. Among them were members of Iraq's ancient Jewish community. In January 1969, 14 people accused of spying, 9 of them Jewish, were publicly executed by hanging in Baghdad's Liberation Square. The government organized massive public rallies around the gallows, bringing hundreds of thousands of citizens to witness the executions. This display demonstrated that the new regime would handle suspected opposition with absolute severity. With political rivals intimidated or eliminated, Saddam turned to restructuring the state apparatus. He understood that physical force alone was insufficient for long-term control. The state also needed to control economic resources and daily public life. During the early 1970s, Saddam directed the expansion of government ministries, replacing career bureaucrats with loyal Ba'ath Party members. The party established student groups, women's federations, labor unions, and peasant associations. Membership in these state-run organizations became essential for securing employment, entering universities, or obtaining government housing. Through this system, daily life in Iraq became tied to political obedience. Economic power was centralized alongside political authority. In June 1972, Saddam oversaw the complete nationalization of the Iraq Petroleum Company, IPC, which had been owned by foreign Western oil corporations. The nationalization of foreign oil interests was a major nationalist goal across the Middle East, and the move was widely popular among the Iraqi public. When global oil prices surged following the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, Iraq's national treasury experienced an unprecedented influx of wealth. Government revenues rose from hundreds of millions of dollars to billions of dollars annually. Saddam used this massive oil revenue to fund a dual strategy, expanding public infrastructure while simultaneously building up the military and security services. The government invested heavily in public works, constructing modern highways, bridges, electrification networks, hospitals, and free public schools. Mass literacy campaigns were launched across the country, winning international recognition from UNESCO. Saddam personally visited villages, schools, and factories, portraying himself as a modernizer committed to improving the lives of ordinary citizens. This combination of public spending and economic development built a strong base of social support, particularly among the lower and middle classes. Behind this modernizing facade, however, the security apparatus continued to grow more sophisticated. Saddam established multiple overlapping intelligence agencies to ensure that no single security service could accumulate enough power to launch a coup. The General Intelligence Directorate monitored foreign affairs, political groups, and civil society. The Directorate of General Security, Alam and Alam, focused on domestic subversion and civilian surveillance. The Military Intelligence Directorate, Al-Istikhbarat al-Askariya, kept watch over the armed forces. Later, Saddam created Special Security Alam al-Qaz, an elite unit assigned to protect the president, monitor other security services, and handle sensitive covert operations. These agencies operated independently of one another, each reporting directly to Saddam through separate lines of command. This system of divided security created a climate of constant surveillance where intelligence officers monitored not only the public, but also each other. A key feature of Saddam's security strategy was the absolute subordination of the regular military to the Ba'ath Party. Historically, Iraq had suffered numerous military coups since the 1930s. To prevent the army from threatening the regime, Saddam introduced political commissars into military units and made party membership mandatory for military officers seeking promotion. Senior officers were frequently rotated, retired, or executed if they demonstrated independent popularity or political ambitions. Saddam also turned his attention to Iraq's complex internal ethnic and sectarian divisions. The two main challenges to central state authority were the Kurdish national movement in the mountainous north and the majority Shia population in the south. In 1970, Saddam negotiated the Iraqi Kurdish Autonomy Agreement with Mustafa Barzani, the leader of the Kurdish Democratic Party, KDP. The agreement promised local self-rule for Kurdish areas and recognized Kurdish as an official language. However, the truce was a tactical move intended to buy time, while the regime consolidated its power in Baghdad. By 1974, disagreements over oil revenues from the city of Kirkuk and the boundary of the autonomous region caused the agreement to break down. Full-scale armed conflict resumed in northern Iraq. The Kurdish forces, supported covertly by Iran, the United States, and Israel, inflicted significant losses on the Iraqi army. Realizing that the Kurds depended on Iranian military support and open borders, Saddam pursued a diplomatic solution with the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. In March 1975, during an OPEC summit in Algiers, Saddam signed the Algiers Accord with the Shah, in exchange for Iran closing its border to Kurdish insurgents and ending all military support for Barzani. Saddam agreed to split control of the Shatt al-Arab waterway, a crucial shipping channel leading to the Persian Gulf, along the middle of its deepwater channel, Thalweg, yielding a long-standing territorial dispute in Iran's favor. Deprived of Iranian supply lines, the Kurdish resistance collapsed within weeks. Tens of thousands of Kurdish fighters and refugees fled across the border, and the central government re-established control over the north. Saddam then initiated a program of forced demographic shifts, forcibly relocating thousands of Kurdish families away from strategic border zones and replacing them with Arab families brought from southern Iraq. Throughout the 1970s, Saddam maintained total operational control while remaining second in command to President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr. Al-Bakr was aging and experiencing declining health, preferring to handle routine administrative duties, while allowing Saddam to manage security, foreign relations, and internal political affairs. Saddam used this period to systematically remove potential rivals within the Ba'ath Party itself, ensuring that all power was centralized in his own office. By 1978, the political landscape of the Middle East began to shift rapidly. In neighboring Iran, popular protests against the Shah gathered strength, culminating in the 1979 Islamic Revolution led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. The rise of a revolutionary Shia Islamist government in Tehran presented an immediate threat to the secular Ba'athist regime in Baghdad, which governed a country with a Shia majority population. Saddam recognized that the ideological challenge from revolutionary Iran, combined with internal opposition, required absolute, unchecked executive authority. At the same time, President al-Bakr attempted to negotiate a political union between Iraq and Syria, which was also governed by a wing of the Ba'ath Party led by President Hafez al-Assad. Under the proposed union, Assad would become the deputy leader of the unified state, which would effectively block Saddam's path to absolute leadership. Saddam moved quickly to disrupt the union negotiations and force al-Bakr out of office. On July 16, 1979, President al-Bakr officially announced his resignation on national television, citing poor health, and transferred all presidential powers to Saddam Hussein. At 42 years old, Saddam achieved his ultimate goal. He became president of the Republic of Iraq, chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and general secretary of the Ba'ath Party Regional Command. Over 11 years of methodical political construction, he had eliminated political opposition, tamed the military, nationalized the economy, and created a pervasive security network. The shadow state he built was now completely under his personal control. Saddam Hussein's ascension to the presidency on July 16, 1979, was not a peaceful transfer of power, nor was it the end of his push for total control. While he had spent more than a decade in the shadows building the security forces and running day-to-day government affairs, formal titles still mattered. In the eyes of the public and the Ba'ath Party hierarchy, Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr had been the official leader of Iraq. With al-Bakr forced into retirement, Saddam held all the highest titles in the country: President of the Republic, Chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and General Secretary of the Ba'ath Party. However, Saddam knew that holding titles was not enough to guarantee his safety. In authoritarian regimes, the most dangerous threats rarely come from external enemies or public protests. They come from within the ruling party itself. Saddam was determined to make sure that no one in the Ba'ath Party would ever dare to question his authority. Only 6 days after taking office, Saddam staged one of the most chilling political purges in modern history. On July 22, 1979, he called an emergency meeting of senior Ba'ath Party officials, regional leaders, and military commanders at the Al-Quld Hall in central Baghdad. Hundreds of men in civilian suits and military uniforms filled the auditorium. They were unaware of what was about to happen. Cameras were set up to record the entire event, and the footage was later distributed across the country to party offices and military barracks to serve as a stark warning. Saddam walked onto the stage in full military uniform, smoking a Cuban cigar. He stood at the podium and addressed the silent room in a calm, measured voice. He announced that a treacherous plot had been discovered within the highest ranks of the party. He claimed that several senior leaders were secretly working with the Syrian government to overthrow him and stop the rise of Iraq. The audience sat in stunned silence. Then, Saddam introduced Mashhadi, the former Secretary General of the Revolutionary Command Council, who had been arrested days earlier. Mashhadi walked onto the stage looking broken and exhausted, clearly tortured. He delivered a forced confession, reading from a prepared script that detailed the alleged conspiracy and named specific co-conspirators sitting in the room. As Mashhadi called out names, Saddam sat at a small table on the stage, casually smoking his cigar and wiping tears from his eyes, pretending to be deeply hurt by the betrayal of his longtime comrades. As each name was spoken, armed security officers stepped from the shadows along the auditorium walls, walked down the aisles, and tapped the accused men on the shoulder. The condemned men were forced to stand up and walk out of the hall. Some shouted their innocence, some begged Saddam for mercy, while others walked out in silent terror. Those remaining in the hall realized that their own lives hung in the balance. Panicked and terrified, members of the audience began jumping to their feet, chanting slogans of loyalty to Saddam, crying out, "Long live Saddam Hussein!" and demanding the death penalty for the accused traitors. Outside the hall, the purged officials were taken to execution grounds. To ensure that the rest of the party leadership was complicit in the bloodletting, Saddam ordered senior party members who were not arrested to form the firing squads themselves. They were handed rifles and forced to execute their former colleagues and friends. Over 50 high-ranking officials were arrested during the purge, and 22 were executed immediately by firing squad, including close personal friends of Saddam who had helped him build the party over 2 decades. Dozens of others were sent to prison, where many died under torture. Through this single, brutally calculated event, Saddam eliminated every potential rival, destroyed the internal democracy of the Ba'ath Party, and demonstrated that absolute loyalty to him personally was the only rule that mattered. With the party purged of any independent voices, Saddam set out to transform the entire political system of Iraq into an extension of his own personality. He systematically weakened every state institution that could act as a check on his power. The Revolutionary Command Council, which had theoretically functioned as a collective decision-making body, became nothing more than a rubber-stamp committee for his decrees. The cabinet of ministers held no real authority. Ministers were treated as administrative clerks who could be dismissed, imprisoned, or killed at the president's whim. Saddam made all major national decisions alone, surrounded by a shrinking circle of sycophants who were too terrified to offer honest advice or report negative news. To ensure complete control over the country's armed forces, Saddam intensified his policy of politicizing and purging the military. Generals who showed genuine military talent or gained popularity among the troops were viewed with deep suspicion. Popular commanders were routinely transferred to administrative posts, forced into retirement, or arrested on fabricated charges of treason. Saddam placed political officers in every military unit down to the company level. These officers reported directly to the Ba'ath Party security network, monitoring commanders for any sign of disloyalty. Promotions were awarded based on tribal loyalty and political devotion rather than military competence. This guarantee against military coups came at a heavy cost. It severely damaged the strategic thinking, initiative, and operational flexibility of the Iraqi armed forces. As Saddam consolidated his absolute political control, he launched a massive, state-directed cult of personality designed to elevate him from a political ruler to a mythic national hero. The state-controlled media, newspapers, radio, and television were dedicated almost entirely to praising his wisdom, courage, and leadership. Every night, state television broadcast patriotic songs written in his honor, showing images of Saddam walking among crowds, inspecting factories, or firing rifles into the air. Poems and plays were written celebrating his childhood and his rise to power, presenting him as a visionary leader sent to restore the glory of the Arab nation. Physical images of Saddam were placed across every square mile of Iraq. Giant portraits, murals, and bronze statues of the president were erected in every city, town, and rural village. His face appeared on postage stamps, banknotes, school textbooks, office walls, and store windows. In public places, he was depicted in various traditional and modern identities to appeal to different segments of the Iraqi population. He was shown in a business suit as a modern westernized leader, in a military uniform as a brave general, in traditional Arab robes as a tribal sheikh, and in northern Kurdish dress as a unifying national ruler. Saddam also sought to legitimize his absolute rule by connecting himself to Iraq's ancient and Islamic history. He commissioned state historians and genealogists to draft a family tree tracing his lineage directly back to the Prophet Muhammad through his grandson Hussein. This manufactured lineage was used to give his rule a sacred, religious justification, presenting him as a defender of the Islamic faith. At the same time, he spent vast sums of public money rebuilding ancient historic sites, particularly the ancient city of Babylon. He ordered the reconstruction of the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, the ancient Babylonian king who had conquered Jerusalem. Saddam had his own name stamped onto the modern bricks used in the reconstruction, directly alongside the ancient inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar, visually linking himself to the great rulers of antiquity. While propaganda and statues presented an image of a beloved leader, the reality of Saddam's rule rested on a pervasive culture of fear and total surveillance. The security agencies built during the 1970s were expanded and given unlimited authority to suppress dissent. The Directorate of General Security, the General Intelligence Directorate, and military intelligence established offices in every administrative district, neighborhood, university, and major workplace. Informants were everywhere. Citizens lived with the constant awareness that a casual remark, a joke about the president, or a failure to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm at a state rally could lead to immediate arrest by secret police. The legal system was completely rewritten to serve the interests of the regime. Revolutionary courts were established to handle political cases. These courts operated without standard legal procedures, right to defense, or appeal. The penal code was modified to include mandatory death sentences for a wide range of political offenses, including insulting the president, joining unauthorized political parties, or attempting to leave the Ba'ath Party. Mass arrests, middle-of-the-night disappearances, and indefinite detentions without trial became standard methods of social control. Families were held collectively responsible for the actions of individual members. If a person fled the country to join an opposition group or deserted from the military, their parents, siblings, and children could be arrested, lose their homes, or be executed. This policy of collective punishment forced families to monitor their own relatives, destroying social trust and instilling fear even within private households. In Saddam's Iraq, silence was not enough to guarantee safety. Active, visible compliance with the regime was required from every citizen. Alongside fear, Saddam used patronage and tribal connections to build a solid core of die-hard supporters. Realizing that he could not rely on ideological commitment to the Ba'ath Party alone, he relied increasingly on his home region of Tikrit and his own tribe, the Albu Nasir. Key posts in government, the military, intelligence services, and elite units like the Republican Guard were reserved almost exclusively for individuals from Tikrit or allied Sunni tribes. These tribal networks were rewarded with money, land, luxury vehicles, and immunity from the law. By tying the wealth and survival of these tribal groups to his own regime, Saddam created a loyal inner guard who knew that the fall of the president would mean their own total destruction. To manage the vast financial resources needed to sustain his security state and reward his loyalists, Saddam maintained total personal control over Iraq's nationalized oil wealth. Following the 1973 oil crisis and the continued rise of global energy prices, Iraq's oil revenues reached record highs by the late 1970s. Billions of dollars flowed into the state treasury every year. Saddam used this wealth to finance ambitious national development projects, expanding electricity grids, building state-of-the-art hospitals, constructing highways, and achieving high literacy rates through mandatory education programs. For a time, these social development programs improved the standard of living for millions of ordinary Iraqis, creating a degree of genuine public support among the middle and working classes. However, these welfare programs were never intended to build a free society. They were designed to make the entire population completely dependent on the central state for their livelihood. Employment in government ministries, access to higher education, medical care, and business licenses were controlled by the Ba'ath Party. Citizens understood that material well-being was a privilege granted by Saddam in exchange for absolute obedience, a privilege that could be revoked instantly at the first sign of disloyalty. By late 1979, Saddam Hussein had successfully completed the total concentration of power in his own hands. The Ba'ath Party was completely purged of opposition. The military was monitored by secret police. The legal system was turned into a tool of state violence, and the population was kept in line through a mixture of state patronage, relentless propaganda, and extreme fear. Saddam had built an absolute dictatorship with himself as the unchallenged center of gravity. Yet, this total control inside Iraq did not satisfy Saddam's ambitions. He viewed himself not merely as the ruler of Iraq, but as the natural leader of the entire Arab world, a modern successor to historic leaders like Saladin. He believed that Iraq's vast oil wealth, modernized society, and powerful military gave the country the right to dominate the Persian Gulf region. But just as Saddam achieved total domestic power, a massive threat emerged directly across Iraq's eastern border. The Islamic Revolution in Iran had overthrown the Shah and established an aggressive, anti-secular government led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini was determined to export his Islamic revolution across the Middle East, explicitly targeting Saddam's secular Ba'athist regime and calling on Iraq's majority Shia population to rise up and overthrow their ruler. Saddam viewed this ideological challenge as an existential threat to his regime and an opportunity to establish Iraq as the dominant power in the region. Driven by fear, ambition, and a fatal miscalculation of his neighbor's strength, Saddam began preparing his country for a confrontation that would plunge the nation into total war. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Saddam Hussein had successfully gathered all political power in Iraq into his own hands. However, holding power in a country with deep ethnic, religious, and political divisions required constant work. To keep total control over the nation, Saddam constructed one of the most ruthless and terrifying security systems in modern history. This system did not rely on standard laws or traditional government bodies. Instead, it operated through secret police organizations, violent state agencies, tribal networks, aggressive state propaganda, and an overwhelming culture of fear that reached into every corner of public and private life in Iraq. At the very center of Saddam's dictatorship was a complex web of competing secret police and intelligence agencies. Saddam intentionally created multiple security services with overlapping responsibilities. This design ensured that no single agency or security official could become powerful enough to challenge him. The three main security organizations were the Directorate of General Security, Alam, the General Intelligence Directorate, Al-Mukhabarat al-Amma, and Military Intelligence, Al-Istikhbarat al-Askariya. The Directorate of General Security was responsible for internal surveillance and keeping watch over ordinary Iraqi citizens. It maintained offices in every city, town, district, workplace, and university across the nation. General Security relied on a massive network of paid and coerced civilian informants. Neighbors were encouraged to spy on neighbors, teachers were pressured to report on students, and workers were rewarded for turning in colleagues who expressed dissatisfaction with the government. The General Intelligence Directorate focused primarily on foreign intelligence, monitoring Iraqi dissidents living abroad, and neutralizing political opponents outside Iraq's borders. Military intelligence kept continuous watch over the armed forces, searching for any signs of military coups or disloyalty among officers. To oversee all these security bodies and protect his personal safety, Saddam created elite, highly specialized units. The most important of these was the Special Security Organization, Alam al-Qas, established to protect Saddam, his family, and his presidential palaces. This agency was given absolute authority over all other intelligence services. It was staffed exclusively by men chosen for their unyielding personal loyalty to Saddam, mostly drawn from his home region. The Special Security Organization monitored the other security agencies, ensuring that even the secret police were under constant surveillance. The methods used by these security agencies were brutal and unconstrained by law. Arbitrary arrest became a daily reality for the Iraqi people. A person could be snatched from their home in the middle of the night by masked agents in unmarked vehicles without any formal charges or arrest warrants. Suspects were taken to hidden detention centers and prisons scattered throughout Baghdad and major provincial cities. Among these facilities, the Abu Ghraib prison complex outside Baghdad became infamous as a primary site of state terror and mass incarceration. Inside Iraq's security prisons, torture was not an occasional abuse. It was a standardized, routine policy used to extract confessions, gather information, and break the human spirit. The regime used extreme physical and psychological techniques. Prisoners faced severe beatings, electrical shocks applied to sensitive parts of the body, sleep deprivation, burnings, mock executions, and prolonged suspension in painful stress positions. Security agents routinely threatened to harm, rape, or kill the family members of detainees in front of them to force compliance. For many victims, the physical damage was permanent, and thousands died under interrogation long before ever seeing a courtroom. The Iraqi legal system was transformed into a simple tool to justify state violence. Standard judicial procedures were replaced in political cases by revolutionary courts and special courts. These tribunals operated behind closed doors. Proceedings were often brief, lasting only a few minutes per defendant. Defendants were routinely denied access to defense lawyers, denied the right to present evidence, and denied any opportunity to appeal their sentences. Judges in these courts were not independent legal professionals. They were Ba'ath Party loyalists who carried out predetermined verdicts delivered directly from the president's office. The legal code was rewritten to make almost any form of political disagreement punishable by death. Under Article 225 of the Iraqi Penal Code, insulting the president, the Ba'ath Party, or state institutions carried a mandatory death sentence. Joining an illegal political organization, such as the Shia Dawa Party or the Iraqi Communist Party, was also a capital offense. Even attempting to leave the Ba'ath Party after becoming a member could result in execution. Mass executions were carried out regularly inside prisons, and the bodies of executed prisoners were frequently not returned to their families for proper burial. In many cases, families were forced to pay the state for the bullets used to execute their loved ones before receiving a death certificate. To prevent opposition from taking root, Saddam implemented a devastating policy of collective punishment. Under this doctrine, an entire family or community was held responsible for the actions of a single individual. If a citizen fled the country to join an opposition movement, deserted from the armed forces, or attempted an act of sabotage, their immediate and extended family members paid a heavy price. Security forces would arrest parents, spouses, and siblings. Homes were demolished, family property was confiscated by the state, and relatives were stripped of their government jobs and pensions. In severe cases, multiple members of a suspect's family were executed as a warning to others. This policy created deep psychological dread. Citizens knew that taking a stand against the regime meant condemning their own children, parents, and relatives to suffering or death. As a result, families were forced to actively monitor and control their own members to ensure total obedience to the state. While fear and violence formed the foundation of the regime's control, Saddam also relied on deep systems of patronage, tribalism, and regional bias. Despite the Ba'ath Party's official ideology of secularism, socialism, and Arab unity, Saddam built his core power structure around clan and tribal loyalties. He placed the highest trust in individuals from his home city of Tikrit and the surrounding sunny Arab heartland along the Tigris River, particularly members of his own tribe, the Al-Bu Nasir. Key positions in the government, security services, military command, and state enterprises were systematically assigned to Tikritis and trusted allied tribal groups. Men from Tikrit held critical posts out of proportion to their actual numbers in the Iraqi population. Saddam's close relatives held many of the most powerful positions in the country. His half-brothers, cousins, and later his sons, Uday and Qusay, controlled major security branches, elite military divisions, and state-run economic enterprises. By tying the survival, wealth, and power of these tribal networks directly to his presidency, Saddam created an inner circle that viewed any threat to his rule as an existential threat to themselves. To maintain the loyalty of these inner groups and the broader Ba'athist elite, Saddam distributed vast financial rewards. Money from state oil revenues was directed into special funds under presidential control. Trusted military officers, party officials, and tribal leaders were rewarded with luxury homes, imported vehicles, large tracts of farmland, high government salaries, and lucrative commercial contracts. They were also granted virtual immunity from civil and criminal laws. This created a privileged ruling class that depended entirely on Saddam's personal favor for its wealth and status. Beyond his tribal core, Saddam actively managed the traditional tribal structures of Iraq. Realizing that decades of rapid modernization had not destroyed tribal identities, he used state funds to buy the loyalty of powerful tribal sheikhs across the country. In exchange for monthly stipends, weapons, and local authority, sheikhs were required to guarantee the loyalty of their tribe members, resolve local disputes according to regime guidelines, and provide young men for military service. If a tribal leader showed signs of independence or failed to control his people, Saddam stripped him of his title, cut off state funding, and replaced him with a more compliant relative. Control over public information was another vital pillar of Saddam's reign. The regime established complete authority over every medium of communication in Iraq. Independent newspapers, private radio stations, and non-state publishing houses were completely banned. All media outlets were directly owned and operated by the Ministry of Information or the Ba'ath Party. News reports were heavily censored, presenting only positive stories about national achievements, state development projects, and the actions of the president. International news was filtered to eliminate any information that might reflect poorly on the regime or expose Iraqi citizens to outside political ideas. This total control of information was used to construct an intense, inescapable cult of personality around Saddam Hussein. The state propaganda machine portrayed him not just as a political president, but as a heroic figure of legendary proportions. He was officially called the Supreme Commander, the Father Leader, and the Knight of the Arab nation. State television aired continuous programming dedicated to his daily activities, showing him visiting farms, inspecting factories, meeting with citizens, and reviewing military units. Patriotic songs praising his wisdom, bravery, and generosity were broadcast repeatedly throughout the day. Every city, town, and small village in Iraq was filled with physical representations of Saddam. Giant painted portraits and large bronze statues were erected in major public squares, outside government buildings, along highways, and inside school courtyards. His image was displayed in every office, shop window, classroom, and hospital waiting room. Saddam was deliberately portrayed in a wide variety of roles to appeal to all segments of Iraqi society. Public artworks showed him in a Western business suit as a modern national reformer, in full military dress as a courageous general, in traditional Bedouin robes as a tribal leader, and in northern Kurdish attire to project national unity. State artists painted him engaging in manual labor or holding infants to show deep care for ordinary people. Education in Iraq was entirely repurposed to serve regime ideology and personal loyalty to the leader. From primary school through university, the curriculum was heavily political. Textbooks were rewritten to highlight Saddam's childhood, his political career, and his official writings. School children were required to memorize his speeches, write essays praising his leadership, and participate in daily morning assemblies where they chanted slogans of absolute devotion to the president. The Ba'ath Party established youth organizations, such as the Vanguard's Al-Taliya and the Ba'ath Youth, which trained young Iraqis in party ideology, basic military drills, and absolute obedience to the state. Children were actively taught that their primary loyalty belonged to Saddam Hussein, even above their own parents. To strengthen his authority among religious populations, Saddam used state resources to link his regime to Islamic history and symbols. Although the Ba'ath Party began as a strictly secular movement, Saddam recognized the deep religious feelings of the Iraqi people. He launched state-sponsored initiatives to repair and expand important historic mosques and religious shrines across the country. He commissioned official genealogical studies to construct a detailed family tree, tracing his lineage directly back to the Prophet Muhammad through his grandson Hussein. This manufactured lineage was widely publicized in newspapers, educational materials, and public broadcasts, to give his secular dictatorship a sacred legitimacy. At the same time, Saddam sought to connect his rule to Iraq's ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. He presented himself as the modern successor to great historical leaders who had ruled the region thousands of years earlier, such as Sargon of Akkad, Hammurabi, and Nebuchadnezzar Roman II. Saddam funded large archaeological and restoration projects at ancient sites, most notably the ancient city of Babylon. During the reconstruction of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, Saddam ordered workers to stamp his own name onto millions of modern construction bricks, copying the ancient practice of Nebuchadnezzar. By placing his name alongside ancient inscriptions, Saddam visually asserted that his reign was part of a continuous history of Mesopotamian greatness. The combined effect of total surveillance, extreme violence, tribal patronage, strict media control, and constant propaganda produced a unique atmosphere of terror across Iraq. Citizens learned that survival required absolute public conformity. It was not enough to simply remain quiet or refrain from criticizing the government. Safety required active participation in the regime's rituals. People felt compelled to attend state-organized rallies, applaud enthusiastically during long presidential speeches, hang portraits of Saddam in their homes, and join the Ba'ath Party to secure basic employment or educational opportunities. This atmosphere of fear, destroyed basic social trust throughout the nation. Because informants were present everywhere and punishment was severe, citizens learned to hide their true political views even from close friends, colleagues, and family members. Conversation in public places was carefully guarded, and political jokes were treated as dangerous acts. The constant threat of arrest, torture, and sudden disappearance created a society in which compliance was driven by a deep survival instinct. By the end of the 1970s, Saddam Hussein had successfully established an absolute dictatorship over Iraq. He had eliminated all organized political opposition within the country, dismantled the internal independence of the ruling Ba'ath Party, brought the military under strict political control, and built a massive security system that monitored every aspect of civilian life. Through a calculated mix of terror, financial rewards, tribal alliances, and intense personal propaganda, he held total command over the state apparatus and the Iraqi population. However, this total domestic control did not mean Iraq was stable or isolated from outside events. The violent methods Saddam used to secure his home front and his personal ambition to project power across the Middle East soon pushed the nation toward massive external conflicts. Directly across Iraq's eastern border, dramatic events were unfolding that would challenge Saddam's control and test his state security apparatus to its absolute limits. The political landscape of the Middle East was about to be reshaped by revolutionary changes in Iran, setting the stage for a prolonged period of regional war. The massive security apparatus and intense domestic control that Saddam Hussein had built inside Iraq were designed to protect his regime from internal revolt. However, by the end of the 1970s, a dramatic political earthquake erupted right across Iraq's eastern border, threatening to shatter Saddam's ambitions and upend the entire geopolitical balance of the Middle East. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution in Iran overthrew the pro-Western monarchy of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The exiled cleric Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Tehran, established a radical Shia theocracy, and proclaimed his intention to export the Islamic Revolution across the Muslim world, specifically targeting Iraq's secular, Sunni-dominated Ba'athist government. For Saddam Hussein, the rise of Khomeini was an existential threat. Iraq possessed a large Shia majority population, and Saddam was deeply afraid that Khomeini's charismatic religious message would inspire Iraqi Shias to rise up and overthrow his regime. At the same time, Saddam saw a historic opportunity. With Iran's military leadership purged, its economy fractured by revolution, and its international standing isolated, Saddam believed that the neighboring nation was weak and vulnerable. He viewed a short, victorious war against Iran as the ultimate path to achieving three major goals: eliminating the immediate threat from Khomeini, seizing control of the disputed Shatt al-Arab waterway, and establishing himself as the undisputed leader of the entire Arab world. Preparations for war began in secret while Saddam consolidated his final steps toward the presidency. The Iraqi military was expanded, supplied with modern Soviet and European weaponry, and placed under the command of loyal generals. Saddam ignored warnings from his advisors, who doubted the readiness of the army for an offensive war against a much larger nation. Convinced of his own strategic genius and blinded by his hatred of the new Iranian leadership, Saddam made the fateful decision to launch a full-scale military invasion of Iran. On September 22, 1980, the conflict formally began when the Iraqi Air Force launched surprise bombing raids against 10 Iranian military airbases, mirroring the tactics of the Israeli Six-Day War. The following day, Iraqi ground divisions crossed the border along a broad front into Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province, a region with a significant ethnic Arab minority that Saddam naively expected would welcome invading Iraqi troops as liberators. Saddam named the Operation Qadisiyah Saddam, deliberately invoking the historic 7th century battle where Arab Muslim armies defeated the Persian Sasanian Empire, framing the modern war as an epic civilizational clash between Arabs and Persians. Initially, Iraqi forces made steady progress, catching the disorganized Iranian military by surprise and capturing territory inside Khuzestan. However, Saddam's strategic calculations quickly began to collapse. The local Iranian Arab population did not revolt in favor of Iraq. Instead, they fiercely defended their homeland alongside their fellow citizens. More importantly, the Iranian nation rallied with extraordinary patriotic and religious fervor around Ayatollah Khomeini. Millions of ordinary Iranians, motivated by deep religious devotion and revolutionary zeal, volunteered to defend the Islamic Republic. Iran mobilized a massive defense effort, relying on newly formed paramilitary forces such as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Basij volunteer militia. Lacking modern heavy weaponry, armored vehicles, and air support due to international arms embargoes, Iran turned to sheer demographic weight and fanatical human wave tactics. Thousands of poorly armed volunteers, including young teenagers and elderly men, were sent forward in human waves to overwhelm Iraqi defensive positions, clear minefields with their bodies, and exhaust the ammunition of the Iraqi army. By 1982, the war had completely shifted from a quick Iraqi land grab into a grinding, catastrophic stalemate. Iranian forces successfully drove the Iraqi military out of Khuzestan, recapturing the strategic port city of Khorramshahr and pushing Iraqi troops back across the international border. Faced with the failure of his initial invasion, Saddam found himself trapped in a long war of attrition that he had neither planned for nor anticipated. The conflict increasingly resembled the brutal trench warfare of World War I, complete with sprawling fortification lines, barbed wire, extensive minefields, massive artillery duels, and devastating infantry battles in the muddy marshlands and arid deserts of the border region. The human and economic cost for Iraq escalated rapidly. To sustain the war effort, Saddam transformed Iraqi society into a total war economy. Consumer goods became scarce, civilian development projects were halted, and all state resources were diverted to the military. As hundreds of thousands of young Iraqi soldiers were deployed to the front lines, the government faced severe labor shortages, which were partially filled by bringing in millions of foreign guest workers from Egypt and other Arab nations. Despite the economic hardship, Saddam maintained strict domestic control, using the threat of wartime execution for anyone accused of desertion, draft dodging, or defeatism. Financing the war proved to be an immense burden. Before the conflict began, Iraq possessed billions of dollars in foreign financial reserves and earned substantial revenue from its vast oil exports. However, Iranian airstrikes and naval attacks systematically destroyed Iraqi oil export terminals in the Persian Gulf, drastically cutting state income. To keep the government and the military functioning, Saddam was forced to borrow massive sums of money. Wealthy neighboring Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, provided tens of billions of dollars in loans and grants to Iraq, terrified that a victorious Iran would export its Islamic revolution across the Persian Gulf monarchies. Major Western powers, including the United States, France, and the Soviet Union, also provided critical economic, diplomatic, and intelligence support to Iraq, preferring Saddam's secular dictatorship over Khomeini's radical religious regime. As the stalemate dragged on year after year with mounting casualties, Saddam's military commanders grew desperate for any advantage to break the Iranian lines. This desperation led the Iraqi regime to cross a profound moral and international boundary by turning to chemical warfare. Beginning in the early 1980s and expanding aggressively through the middle of the decade, Iraqi state laboratories and military production facilities manufactured massive quantities of chemical weapons, including blister agents like mustard gas and lethal nerve agents such as tabun and sarin. Iraqi forces began deploying these illegal weapons systematically against Iranian military formations. Artillery shells and aerial bombs filled with deadly gas were dropped onto Iranian troop concentrations to halt massive human wave assaults. The effects were horrific. Soldiers exposed to mustard gas suffered severe skin blisters, blindness, and agonizing respiratory damage, while nerve agents caused rapid paralysis, suffocation, and death within minutes. In addition to using chemical weapons on the battlefield, Saddam did not hesitate to deploy them against civilian populations when he suspected disloyalty. During counterinsurgency operations in northern Iraq against Kurdish groups that sided with Iran, the regime used chemical weapons against civilian towns, resulting in mass civilian casualties that horrified the international community. Despite clear evidence of widespread chemical weapons use documented by United Nations inspectors, the international community largely muted its criticism of Saddam's regime. The United States and its European allies continued to provide intelligence and diplomatic cover to Iraq because preventing an Iranian victory remained their primary strategic objective in the region. This tacit international tolerance emboldened Saddam, reinforcing his belief that he could use any level of violence necessary to ensure his survival. As the war dragged into its later years, the violence expanded far beyond the front lines into the skies and cities of both nations. In what became known as the War of the Cities, both Iraq and Iran launched long-range ballistic missile attacks against each other's major urban centers. Iraqi forces modified Soviet-supplied Scud missiles to increase their range, renaming them the Al-Hussein and Al-Abbas, and fired them repeatedly at Tehran, Isfahan, and Qom. Iran retaliated by firing missiles into Baghdad and Basra. These indiscriminate attacks terrorized urban populations, destroyed residential neighborhoods, and forced millions of civilians to flee the cities, adding immense psychological trauma to an already exhausted populace. By 1988, both nations were economically shattered, socially exhausted, and facing complete financial ruin. Iraq was saddled with over $80 billion in foreign debt. Its oil infrastructure was heavily damaged, and its population was mourning a generation of young men lost to the front lines. Iran, suffering from even greater human losses and severe economic isolation, finally realized it could not achieve its goal of toppling Saddam's regime. Under intense international pressure and facing mounting military setbacks on the battlefield, Iran accepted United Nations Security Council Resolution 598. A formal ceasefire went into effect on August 28, 1988, ending the 8-year war. The Iran-Iraq War concluded without any territorial changes or clear military victors. Yet the human cost was staggering. Between 500,000 and 1 million people had died on both sides, with hundreds of thousands more wounded, disabled, or permanently scarred by chemical weapons. For Iraq, the war left deep physical and psychological scars. However, Saddam Hussein shrewdly manipulated the end of the conflict to project an image of glorious triumph. State propaganda celebrated the ceasefire not as a costly stalemate, but as a historic victory for the Arab nation and for Saddam's personal leadership over the Persian armies of Iran. Rather than weakening his dictatorship, the 8-year war paradoxically strengthened Saddam's grip on power in the short term. It allowed him to transform Iraq into a heavily armed garrison state, expand his security apparatus, test lethal new weapons, and maintain absolute control over a population conditioned to endure extreme hardship and fear. With a battle-hardened military of over 1 million men, an expanded arsenal of advanced weaponry, and a massive national debt owed to his Arab neighbors, Saddam turned his gaze toward new geopolitical ambitions, setting the stage for his next catastrophic miscalculation in the region. The end of the grueling 8-year war with Iran did not bring peace, relief, or prosperity to the people of Iraq. Instead, it marked the beginning of one of the darkest and most terrifying chapters in the country's modern history. While Saddam Hussein publicly celebrated the 1988 ceasefire as a glorious historic victory against the Persian enemy, behind closed doors, his regime was facing an immense internal crisis. The nation was saddled with massive foreign debts, its economy was crippled, and hundreds of thousands of families were mourning sons, brothers and fathers who had perished on the battlefields. Rather than easing authoritarian controls or opening up society after years of immense sacrifice, Saddam chose to double down on terror, suspicion, and absolute control. He turned the fearsome machinery of the state inward, launching systematic, brutal campaigns of internal repression against any community, group, or individual he perceived as a threat to his continued rule. During the long years of the Iran-Iraq conflict, the various ethnic and religious minority populations within Iraq had lived under intense scrutiny. Among them, the Kurdish population living in the rugged, mountainous northern provinces of the country posed a particular challenge to the Ba'athist government. For decades, Kurdish political parties had fought intermittent guerrilla campaigns seeking greater autonomy or independence from Baghdad. During the war with Iran, some Kurdish factions, most notably the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan and the Kurdistan Democratic Party, had taken advantage of the government's preoccupation with the front lines. They allied themselves with the Iranian regime, providing intelligence and military support against Saddam's forces. To Saddam and his inner circle, this collaboration was the ultimate act of treason. They viewed the northern Kurds not merely as political dissidents, but as an existential fifth column working hand in hand with a foreign enemy to dismantle the Iraqi state. Even before the formal ceasefire with Iran took effect, the regime began planning a final, devastating reckoning in the north. This brutal undertaking was placed under the direct command of Saddam's notorious cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid, who would soon earn the blood-soaked moniker Chemical Ali. Al-Majid was appointed as the Secretary General of the Northern Bureau of the Ba'ath Party, granting him absolute authority over all military, security, and civilian agencies in the Kurdish regions. He shared Saddam's cold, ruthless worldview and believed that conventional military tactics were insufficient to permanently crush the Kurdish insurgency. Instead, al-Majid advocated for total eradication, forced displacement, and collective punishment on a massive scale, laying the groundwork for the infamous Al-Anfal campaign. The Al-Anfal campaign, named after a surah in the Quran that deals with the spoils of war, was executed in a series of sweeping military offensives launched throughout 1988. The operation was designed to systematically destroy the economic infrastructure, villages, and population base of the Kurdish resistance once and for all. Tens of thousands of Iraqi troops, supported by heavy artillery, helicopter gunships, and elite Republican Guard units, encircled entire rural districts. They cut off escape routes, bombed civilian settlements, and rounded up tens of thousands of unarmed villagers, including women, children, and the elderly. Those captured were loaded onto military trucks and transported away from their ancestral homes to remote, hastily constructed detention camps and concentration centers scattered across the barren deserts of southern and western Iraq. Conditions in these detention centers were horrific. Families were separated, with young men and teenage boys systematically segregated from the rest of the population. In many cases, these captured men and boys were taken out to remote desert locations in the dead of night, executed by firing squads, and dumped into massive mass graves hastily covered by bulldozers. Thousands of others simply vanished without a trace, becoming victims of the state's relentless campaign of forced disappearances. For the women, children, and elderly left behind in the camps, disease, malnutrition, and psychological terror became daily realities. Entire generations of rural Kurdish society were uprooted, their homes dynamited, their orchards burned, and their water wells poisoned to ensure they could never return to their traditional lands. The most horrific and infamous manifestation of this state-sponsored terror occurred on March 16, 1988, in the Kurdish town of Halabja. As the Iran-Iraq War was drawing to its close, Kurdish Peshmerga fighters, backed by Iranian troops, briefly entered and occupied the town. Furious at this local collaboration, and determined to send an unmistakable message of deterrence to the entire region, Saddam's military leadership ordered a massive chemical bombardment of Halabja. Iraqi warplanes circled overhead, dropping an apocalyptic cocktail of lethal gases, including mustard gas and nerve agents such as sarin, tabun, and VX. The gas settled heavily over the town because it was heavier than air, seeping into basements and shelters where families had huddled for safety. The immediate aftermath of the Halabja attack was an apocalyptic humanitarian disaster. Thousands of civilians, including hundreds of children and infants, died within minutes, collapsing in the streets in their homes or while trying to flee. Survivors suffered agonizing long-term health consequences, including permanent blindness, severe respiratory damage, skin disfigurement, neurological disorders, and elevated rates of miscarriages and birth defects in the decades that followed. International journalists and medical teams who visited Halabja shortly after the attack captured haunting photographs of victims frozen in death in the exact moments they were overcome by the toxic fumes. Despite global outrage and widespread condemnation from human rights organizations, the Iraqi regime initially attempted to deny responsibility, absurdly blaming the Iranian military for the massacre. However, the sheer volume of physical and medical evidence left no doubt that the Iraqi state had turned weapons of mass destruction directly against its own civilian population. While the northern campaigns targeted the Kurdish minority with industrial-scale violence, domestic repression in the rest of the country was equally severe and pervasive. Saddam's regime maintained an iron grip on the Shia majority in central and southern Iraq, well aware of their historical religious ties to Iran and their potential to ignite an internal revolution. To preempt any domestic uprising, the security apparatus infiltrated every single aspect of Iraqi daily life. Informants were everywhere, neighbors spying on neighbors, students reporting on teachers, and shopkeepers watching customers. The Mukhabarat, the General Intelligence Service, operated with total impunity, arresting anyone suspected of insufficient loyalty, whispered jokes about the president, or unauthorized religious gatherings. Political dissent was treated as a capital offense, and the penal code was expanded to include the death penalty for a vast array of ordinary offenses, including economic crimes, insulting the president, draft evasion, and minor political activism. Prisons such as Abu Ghraib and the infamous Nugat al-Salman detention facility in the remote southern desert became sprawling houses of horror. Inside these heavily guarded walls, political prisoners, suspected dissidents, and ordinary citizens accused of subversion were subjected to routine, systematic torture designed to break their spirits and extract forced confessions. Methods included severe beatings, electric shocks, psychological abuse, mock executions, acid baths, and sexual violence. Torture was not merely used as an interrogation tool. It was utilized as a pillar of governance, designed to instill a paralyzing, generational fear that would deter anyone from even contemplating opposition to Saddam's rule. In addition to direct physical violence, the regime exerted absolute control over Iraqi society through an all-encompassing cult of personality. Saddam Hussein's face stared down from billboards, government offices, school textbooks, currency notes, and television screens in every corner of the country. He was portrayed not merely as a political leader, but as a paternal guardian, a military genius, a devout Muslim, and the direct heir to ancient Mesopotamian heroes like Nebuchadnezzar and Hammurabi. State-controlled media broadcasted endless hagiographies, songs and poems praising his wisdom, strength, and benevolence. Public loyalty was enforced through mandatory participation in Ba'ath Party rallies, youth organizations, and national parades. Refusing to participate or failing to display sufficient enthusiasm could result in severe professional consequences, imprisonment, or being branded as an enemy of the state. Family networks and tribal alliances were carefully manipulated to reinforce the dictator's power. Saddam surrounded himself with trusted loyalists drawn primarily from his hometown of Tikrit and his extended clan, placing them in key positions within the military, the intelligence services, and the ruling Ba'ath Party leadership. This inner circle was bound to Saddam through a complex system of shared patronage, economic privilege, and mutual complicity in state crimes. Anyone within the regime who showed independent ambition or questioned Saddam's directives was swiftly purged, demoted, or executed, ensuring that no potential challenger could ever rise to threaten his absolute authority. By the end of the 1980s, the combination of ruthless domestic terror, military might, and totalitarian control had earned Saddam Hussein undeniable international notoriety. The global media and human rights organizations increasingly referred to him by the grim title that reflected his brutal methods, the Butcher of Baghdad. Yet, inside Iraq, the atmosphere was one of profound, suffocating resignation. The population was exhausted by war, cowed by the omnipresent secret police, and traumatized by the devastating campaigns in the north and the south. Saddam had successfully transformed Iraq into a heavily fortified police state, where survival depended entirely on absolute obedience and outward displays of unwavering loyalty. Confident that his domestic security apparatus was completely impregnable, and that his military strength was unmatched in the region, Saddam turned his gaze outward once again. He failed to recognize that the very brutality and repression that kept him securely in power at home were rapidly isolating him on the international stage. His vast military machine, bloated by the 8-year war with Iran and sustained by massive foreign debt, was hungry for resources, prestige, and regional dominance. The stage was set for Saddam to make another catastrophic miscalculation, one that would bring the wrath of the global community crashing down upon his regime and push Iraq toward an entirely new abyss. The end of the 1980s left Iraq in a deep financial crisis. The costly 8-year war with Iran had drained the country's wealth, leaving it with billions of dollars in foreign debt. Saddam Hussein had borrowed heavily from neighboring Arab nations, especially Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, during the conflict. He believed these countries should cancel his debts. He argued that Iraq had acted as a protective shield for the entire Arab world against the spread of Iran's Islamic Revolution. However, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia refused to forgive the loans. They expected Iraq to pay back every dinar. Adding to Saddam's financial troubles, Kuwait began pumping more oil than its assigned quota set by the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. This overproduction caused global oil prices to drop sharply. For Iraq, an economy almost entirely dependent on oil exports, every drop in the price per barrel meant a severe loss of national income. Saddam's government desperately needed high oil revenues to rebuild its shattered infrastructure, pay its massive army, and maintain the complex patronage system that kept his regime stable. To make matters worse, Iraq accused Kuwait of slant drilling, crossing the international border underground to extract oil from Iraq's giant Rumaila oil field. Tensions between Baghdad and Kuwait grew steadily worse throughout the first half of 1990. Saddam viewed Kuwait not as a legitimate, independent sovereign nation, but as an artificial creation of British colonial powers designed to deprive Iraq of its rightful access to the Persian Gulf. Historically, Iraqi governments had occasionally laid claim to Kuwait, but Saddam decided to turn these old grievances into an active, aggressive threat. In July 1990, the Iraqi regime launched a harsh diplomatic offensive against Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates, accusing them of waging an economic war against Iraq. Saddam summoned foreign diplomats and delivered fiery speeches, blaming outside forces for stealing Iraq's wealth and harming its people. He deployed massive military forces, including elite Republican Guard divisions, right up to the Kuwaiti border. The international community grew alarmed by the heavy troop buildup. World leaders, including diplomats from the United States, urged restraint and tried to negotiate a peaceful resolution. U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, met with Saddam Hussein in late July 1990. During their conversation, she indicated that the United States had no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts, a diplomatic nuance that Saddam disastrously misinterpreted as a green light or a lack of resolve from Washington. Convinced that the United States and other Western powers would not intervene, and desperate for a quick financial fix, Saddam made a fateful decision. In the early morning hours of August 2, 1990, Iraqi military forces crossed the border into Kuwait. The invasion was swift and overwhelming. Kuwait's small military was completely unprepared for the sudden assault. Iraqi tanks rolled down the wide boulevards of Kuwait City, seizing government buildings, key communication hubs, and strategic military installations. The ruling emir of Kuwait, Sheikh Jaber al-Ahmed al-Sabah, narrowly escaped into exile in Saudi Arabia, fleeing across the desert just as Iraqi forces advanced on his palace. Within hours, Iraq had occupied the entire country. Saddam announced that Kuwait was no longer a separate nation, declaring it to be the 19th province of Iraq. He appointed a puppet military government and installed loyal Ba'athist officials to run the captured territory. Saddam believed he had secured a brilliant victory that would solve Iraq's economic troubles, expand its coastline, and establish him as the undisputed leader of the Arab world. Instead, the invasion of Kuwait stunned the international community and triggered an immediate, furious global backlash. Nations across the globe, regardless of political alignment, condemned the naked act of aggression. The United Nations Security Council acted with rare and rapid unity, passing a series of strict resolutions demanding that Iraq withdraw its forces from Kuwait unconditionally. When Saddam ignored these warnings and refused to budge, the UN imposed a total and comprehensive trade embargo on Iraq, cutting off all imports and exports, including essential food and medical supplies, in an effort to strangle the Iraqi economy. Behind the scenes, United States President George H.W. Bush began building a massive international coalition to force Iraq out of Kuwait. Washington understood that allowing a brutal dictator to violently annex a neighboring sovereign nation and control a massive share of the world's oil supply would set a dangerous global precedent. American diplomats worked tirelessly to gather support from European allies, Arab nations, and even the Soviet Union. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and the United Kingdom agreed to join the coalition, contributing troops, financial backing, and military bases. As the autumn of 1990 turned into winter, hundreds of thousands of coalition soldiers poured into Saudi Arabia in an operation codenamed Desert Shield. They massed along the southern border of Kuwait, preparing for a potential military showdown. Saddam Hussein remained defiant. Safe inside his well-guarded palace in Baghdad, he miscalculated the determination of the coalition. He genuinely believed that the Western powers lacked the stomach for a prolonged, bloody ground war, and that public opinion in the United States would collapse at the first sight of military casualties. Saddam tried to use psychological warfare and political leverage to break the coalition. He took foreign nationals who were caught in Iraq and Kuwait as hostages, placing them at strategic military and industrial sites to act as human shields against coalition airstrikes. He also attempted to rally Arab and Muslim populations to his side by framing the conflict as a holy struggle against Western imperialism and Zionism, even launching Scud missiles at Israel in a calculated effort to provoke a wider regional war that might shatter the fragile coalition. However, these tactics failed to break the unity of the coalition or weaken the resolve of the United Nations. Diplomacy stalled completely by mid-January 1991, as Saddam stubbornly refused to comply with international deadlines for withdrawal. The economic sanctions were choking Iraq's civilian population, yet Saddam showed no remorse or willingness to compromise, prioritizing his own pride and power above the safety and well-being of his citizens. By early January 1991, the diplomatic window had officially closed. The massive armada of coalition air and naval forces stationed in the Persian Gulf and surrounding countries stood ready, waiting for the final order to launch the offensive. Saddam Hussein's aggressive gamble to seize Kuwait had transformed a regional financial crisis into a global crisis. The stage was set for a massive military confrontation that would shatter Iraq's armed forces, devastate its infrastructure, and plunge Saddam's regime into an era of severe international isolation and unprecedented domestic turmoil. The massive air campaign launched by the international coalition in mid-January 1991 shattered Iraq's military power in a matter of weeks. When the ground offensive, known as Operation Desert Storm, began in late February, Iraqi forces in Kuwait collapsed under the overwhelming superiority of coalition technology, air power, and strategy. Within just 100 hours, the occupation of Kuwait was brought to an end, and surviving Iraqi units retreated in total disarray, leaving behind burned-out armor, destroyed equipment, and a broken nation. Saddam Hussein tried to present the withdrawal as a steadfast military resistance, but the reality on the ground was catastrophic. The backbone of Iraq's once feared armed forces lay in ruins, and the country was suddenly thrust into an era of unprecedented chaos and vulnerability. With the military defeat came an immediate and devastating internal explosion. For decades, Saddam had ruled through absolute terror, suppressing the diverse ethnic and religious groups that made up the Iraqi population. The Shiite majority in the south and the Kurdish population in the north had suffered terribly under Ba'athist rule, enduring purges, forced displacement, and systemic discrimination. Encouraged by the collapse of the army and a radio broadcast from the United States urging the Iraqi people to rise up and overthrow Saddam from within, both populations revolted. In March 1991, uprisings erupted across southern cities like Basra, Najaf, and Karbala, while Kurdish fighters and local militias seized control of major towns across the northern mountains. For a brief moment, it appeared that the regime was finally crumbling from the inside out. However, Saddam retained control of his most loyal and hardened forces, particularly the elite Republican Guard divisions that had managed to withdraw from the front lines relatively intact. Unwilling to relinquish power, Saddam unleashed a ruthless counteroffensive to crush the rebellions with absolute brutality. In the south, Republican Guard tanks rolled into wholly Shiite cities, shelling residential areas, executing suspected rebels in the streets, and destroying sacred shrines. Thousands of civilians were rounded up and massacred without trial, their bodies dumped into mass graves. Similar atrocities unfolded in the north, where government forces launched a ferocious scorched earth campaign against the Kurdish population. Fearing total extermination, nearly 2 million Kurds fled toward the borders of Turkey and Iran, triggering a massive humanitarian crisis in the freezing mountain passes as refugees struggled to survive without food, shelter, or medical care. The horrific plight of the refugees forced the international community to intervene once again, though this time through humanitarian and protective measures, rather than direct combat against the central government. The United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 688, condemning the brutal repression of the Iraqi civilian population. Shortly afterward, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France established no-fly zones across northern and southern Iraq. Coalition aircraft patrolled the skies to prevent Iraqi warplanes and helicopters from attacking civilian populations on the ground. These safe havens allowed the Kurds to return from the mountains and establish a largely autonomous region in northern Iraq, effectively splitting the country's governance and dealing a permanent blow to Saddam's ambition of total, uninterrupted control over his entire territory. While internal rebellions were brutally suppressed, the external punishment imposed by the international community took the form of a sweeping and comprehensive regime of economic sanctions. The United Nations Security Council made it clear that sanctions would remain in place until Iraq fully dismantled its weapons of mass destruction programs, including chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons infrastructure. Resolution 687 established a special UN commission, known as UNSCOM, tasked with locating, inspecting, and destroying all prohibited weapons systems inside Iraq. For Saddam, these inspections represented a humiliating intrusion into state sovereignty. He viewed the disarmament demands as an existential threat to his regime's deterrent power, and began a long, exhausting game of cat and mouse with international inspectors, hiding documents, moving equipment, and repeatedly lying about the true scope of Iraq's secret military programs. The comprehensive economic embargo hit ordinary Iraqi citizens with devastating force. Because all international trade was strictly blocked, Iraq could not export its oil or import essential goods freely. The country's economy went into a severe freefall. The national currency, the Iraqi dinar, lost nearly all of its value, turning life savings into worthless paper almost overnight. Basic food items, clean drinking water, and vital medical supplies became extremely scarce and prohibitively expensive. Hospitals lacked basic medicines, anesthetics, and clean equipment, leading to a tragic surge in preventable diseases and infant mortality. International organizations and aid workers documented a heart-wrenching humanitarian catastrophe across the country, where millions of families slid into grinding poverty and malnutrition. Yet, even as ordinary citizens suffered immensely, Saddam Hussein and his inner circle insulated themselves from the hardship, while children starved in public hospitals and families stood in endless lines for meager rations. The regime constructed dozens of lavish presidential palaces across the country, featuring marble floors, artificial lakes, and opulent banquet halls. Saddam used the crisis to consolidate his personal power even further, shifting the economic survival of the population away from the free market and placing it entirely in the hands of the state. He introduced a government-run ration card system, distributing basic food supplies to every household. This system created a profound psychological dependency. Citizens became entirely reliant on the government just to stay alive, making mass political dissent almost impossible, because anyone who spoke out against the regime risked losing their monthly food rations. To maintain control over a fractured society, Saddam intensified the security apparatus, turning Iraq into a sprawling police state where paranoia and suspicion dominated daily life. The intelligence services, including the feared Special Security Organization and the Mukhabarat, infiltrated every level of society, from government ministries and military ranks down to local neighborhoods, universities, and family networks. Informants were everywhere, and neighbors regularly reported one another out of fear or to settle personal scores. Torture, arbitrary arrest, and public executions were used routinely to stamp out any whisper of opposition. Saddam also launched a calculated campaign of religious and tribal co-optation, presenting himself as a devout Muslim leader and forging strategic alliances with powerful tribal chiefs across the countryside. By distributing land, weapons, and money to loyal tribal leaders, he ensured a secondary layer of internal security that could help police the population and track down potential subversives. Despite complete international isolation, military defeat, and severe domestic suffering, Saddam's survival strategy proved remarkably resilient in the short term. He successfully managed to blame all of Iraq's miseries on foreign enemies, portraying the UN sanctions and American hostility as an ongoing imperialist conspiracy designed to destroy the Arab nation. State-controlled media broadcast endless propaganda celebrating the president as a heroic survivor standing tall against Western aggression. Portraits, statues, and billboards bearing his likeness multiplied across every city street, reinforcing the omnipresent cult of personality that defined his dictatorship. Saddam was convinced that if he simply outlasted the international coalition's patience, the sanctions would eventually collapse, trade would resume, and his regional ambitions would be restored. However, the strategy of defiance came at a staggering long-term cost. Iraq was transformed from a wealthy, modernizing regional powerhouse into an isolated, ruined pariah state. Its infrastructure was crumbling, its scientific and educational institutions were gutted by the brain drain of educated professionals fleeing the country, and its military was a mere shadow of its former self. The delicate ethnic and sectarian balance within the population had been violently fractured, leaving deep, unhealed wounds between the Sunni leadership, the repressed Shiite majority, and the autonomous Kurds in the north. Saddam had managed to save his own throne from the immediate wreckage of the Gulf War, but he had trapped himself and his country inside a suffocating cage of perpetual crisis, paving the way for the ultimate, inevitable showdown with a hostile world that was simply waiting for the next opportunity to remove him from power. The decade following the Gulf War was characterized by a slow, relentless tightening of the noose around Saddam Hussein's regime. While the dictator had successfully weathered the internal uprisings and the immediate economic collapse of the early 1990s, the underlying conflict between Iraq and the international community was never truly resolved. At the center of this ongoing standoff was the relentless pursuit of weapons of mass destruction by United Nations inspectors, a process that transformed Iraq into the most heavily scrutinized nation on Earth. For Washington, London, and the United Nations Security Council, the central question of the post-war era was not just whether Iraq could recover economically, but whether Saddam could ever be trusted to disarm. The diplomatic friction over disarmament eventually escalated into a full-blown confrontation, setting the stage for the dramatic and fateful events of the early 2000s. The mechanism established to ensure Iraq's compliance with the post-war ceasefire was the United Nations Special Commission, known as UNSCOM, alongside the International Atomic Energy Agency. Led initially by figures like Rolf Ekéus and later Richard Butler, these international inspectors were tasked with unearthing and destroying Iraq's remaining chemical, biological, and nuclear infrastructure. From the very beginning, Saddam's government adopted a strategy of calculated deception, obstruction, and delay. Iraqi officials insisted that they had fully complied with disarmament demands, and that all stockpiles had been destroyed during the war. However, they consistently refused to provide verifiable documentation or full access to sensitive government sites, laboratories, and military installations. This cat-and-mouse game between Baghdad and the United Nations played out over several tense years. Inspectors would demand access to a specific building, only to be blocked for hours or days by Iraqi security forces while documents were shredded, equipment was loaded onto trucks, and materials were secretly relocated across the country. Whenever inspectors pushed too hard, Saddam would threaten to halt all cooperation, expel inspectors entirely, or shoot down U.S. reconnaissance planes patrolling the skies. These crises triggered repeated standoffs that frequently brought the region to the brink of renewed military conflict. In late 1998, after years of persistent obstruction and the final withdrawal of cooperation by Baghdad, the United States and the United Kingdom launched Operation Desert Fox, a 4-day intensive bombing campaign targeting Iraqi command centers, air defenses, and suspected weapons facilities. Although the strikes inflicted heavy damage on military infrastructure, they failed to dislodge Saddam or force full compliance, and UNSCOM was permanently withdrawn from the country. By the late 1990s, the international consensus regarding Iraq was beginning to fracture, particularly over the devastating humanitarian toll of the sweeping economic sanctions. While Washington and London maintained that the embargo must remain strictly in place until complete disarmament was verified, other members of the UN Security Council, including France, Russia, and China, argued that the sanctions were punishing ordinary citizens far more than the regime. To alleviate the catastrophic suffering inside hospitals and schools, The UN introduced the Oil for Food program in 1996. This system allowed Iraq to sell a limited amount of oil on the international market, with the proceeds held in a UN escrow account and used exclusively to purchase food, medicine, and basic humanitarian supplies for the Iraqi population. For Saddam Hussein, the Oil for Food program was both a lifeline and an opportunity for manipulation. While the program did succeed in preventing widespread starvation and provided a baseline of food security through the ration card system, the regime quickly found ways to subvert it for its own financial and political benefit. Iraqi officials began demanding illegal kickbacks and surcharges from foreign companies seeking to purchase oil or supply humanitarian goods under the program. Millions of dollars were skimmed off the top and funneled into secret accounts abroad, providing Saddam with illicit revenue that he used to line his pockets, bribe foreign politicians, and finance his inner circle while evading international financial controls. Furthermore, the regime routinely blamed the UN and the United States for any shortages or bureaucratic delays in the delivery of medicine and food, weaponizing the humanitarian crisis in global propaganda to erode international support for the sanctions. Inside Iraq, the atmosphere of paranoia and total control reached its peak during these years. Saddam continued to reshuffle his military and security commands frequently, terrified of a palace coup or an assassination plot from within his own inner circle. Members of his family, including his sons Uday and Qusay, wielded terrifying levels of arbitrary power. Uday, known for his violent temper and erratic behavior, controlled the paramilitary Fedayeen Saddam, ran media outlets, and was notorious for arbitrary arrests, torture, and brutality against ordinary citizens. Qusay, more quiet and methodical, took charge of the elite security apparatus, the Republican Guard, and the intelligence services, quietly positioning himself as his father's designated successor. No one within the regime dared to challenge them, and the ordinary population lived in a state of suspended animation, exhausted by poverty, isolation, and constant fear. Externally, the geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically following the terrorist attacks on the United States on September 11, 2001. In Washington, the administration of President George W. Bush seized upon the tragedy to fundamentally reshape U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, adopting a doctrine of preemptive action against hostile regimes that possessed or sought weapons of mass destruction and harbored terrorist networks. Although no direct operational link existed between Saddam Hussein's secular Ba'athist government and the radical Islamist group Al-Qaeda, U.S. officials increasingly pointed to Iraq as an intolerable danger that could no longer be contained or deterred. Throughout 2002, the diplomatic drums of war began to beat with mounting intensity. President Bush addressed the United Nations General Assembly, challenging the international community to enforce its own resolutions against Iraq or watch them become entirely irrelevant. Under immense diplomatic pressure, Saddam reluctantly agreed to allow international inspectors back into Iraq in late 2002 under a new body called UNMOVIC, led by Hans Blix, alongside the IEA led by Mohammed El-Baradei. For several months, inspectors crisscrossed the country, visiting presidential palaces, research facilities, and remote desert sites. While they found no smoking gun or active weapons of mass destruction programs, they reported that Iraq was failing to provide proactive, fully transparent cooperation or documentary proof of past unilateral destruction of chemical and biological agents. For the United States and its closest allies, particularly the United Kingdom under Prime Minister Tony Blair, Iraq's lack of total, active cooperation was interpreted as proof that hidden weapons programs remained active and deceptive practices were continuing. Diplomatic efforts at the United Nations Security Council to pass a new resolution explicitly authorizing military force stalled in early 2003, as France, Germany, and other nations argued that inspections were working and that peaceful containment should be given more time. Frustrated by diplomatic deadlock and convinced that Saddam posed an imminent danger, Washington declared that diplomacy had reached its absolute end. In March 2003, the United States and the United Kingdom, backed by a coalition of willing nations, issued a final ultimatum demanding that Saddam Hussein and his sons step down and leave Iraq within 48 hours. Saddam rejected the demand with characteristic defiance, delivering a televised speech proclaiming that the Iraqi people would crush the invaders and that victory was certain. As the ultimatum expired, the world held its breath. On the night of March 19, 2003, the first cruise missiles struck targets in Baghdad, officially initiating Operation Iraqi Freedom and plunging the ancient city into the opening salvo of a war that would finally bring down the brutal, decades-long reign of the Butcher of Baghdad. The final chapter of Saddam Hussein's decades-long dictatorship began on the evening of March 19, 2003, with the fiery descent of cruise missiles upon Baghdad. Operation Iraqi Freedom, spearheaded by the United States and the United Kingdom alongside a coalition of international forces, was launched with a targeted strike intended to decapitate the regime. Yet, despite the shock and awe of the initial bombardment, the vast and entrenched machinery of the Ba'ath Party did not instantly crumble. For years, the regime had prepared for an eventual military confrontation, digging bunkers, dispersing military assets, and establishing command nodes within urban centers. As the coalition ground forces rolled across the Kuwaiti border and pushed northward through the sprawling desert expanses of southern Iraq, they encountered a multi-layered defense comprised of regular army units, the elite Republican Guard, and the fierce, irregular paramilitaries of the Fedayeen Saddam. From the very beginning of the invasion, the strategic landscape was defined by an asymmetric clash of military might. Coalition forces, equipped with superior technological capabilities, advanced air support, and highly mobile armored columns, bypassed major population centers in the south to maintain a relentless momentum toward Baghdad. However, this rapid advance left extended supply lines vulnerable to hit-and-run ambushes by loyalist paramilitaries operating in towns like Nasiriyah, Najaf, and Karbala. The fighting in these urban pockets was fierce, chaotic, and bloody. Yet, despite pockets of desperate resistance, the Iraqi military machine was fundamentally outmatched. The vaunted Republican Guard divisions, deployed as shields around the capital, were relentlessly pulverized by coalition air power, their command structures shattered and their morale eroded by weeks of relentless bombardment. Inside Baghdad, the atmosphere was one of eerie tension, surreal contrasts, and escalating panic. Information control, a cornerstone of Saddam's rule for over 30 years, remained absolute until the final moments. The Iraqi Minister of Information, Mohammed Said al-Sahaf, appeared before international television cameras on a daily basis to deliver defiant, surreal press conferences. Even as American tanks rolled into the outskirts of the city and smoke billowed from burning government ministries, Sahaf famously insisted that the invading troops were committing suicide at the gates of Baghdad, and that victory was imminent. For ordinary Iraqis living under the constant roar of jets and the concussive blasts of explosions, These broadcasts were a bizarre testament to a regime completely divorced from reality. Behind the facade of televised defiance, the ruling elite was fracturing. Senior military commanders, provincial governors, and inner-circle confidants realized the end had arrived and began making individual accommodations or fleeing into hiding. By early April, the outer defenses of Baghdad had completely dissolved. On April 5 and 6, armored spearheads of the U.S. Army conducted massive reconnaissance and force raids directly into the heart of the capital, famously known as Thunder Runs. These armored columns surged down major highways, past presidential palaces and government headquarters, demonstrating total coalition dominance within the city center. The psychological impact of these armored thrusts was devastating to the regime. It proved that the capital was indefensible and that the dictator's grip had finally been broken. On April 7, a precision airstrike targeted a residential area in the Mansur district of Baghdad, where intelligence suggested Saddam and his sons might be meeting. While the strike destroyed the building and created a massive crater, Saddam had narrowly escaped moments earlier. On April 9, 2003, the physical collapse of the Ba'athist regime reached its iconic climax. In Firdos Square, in the center of Baghdad, a crowd of weary and jubilant Iraqi citizens gathered around the base of a towering bronze statue of Saddam Hussein. With the assistance of a U.S. Marine recovery vehicle, a chain was looped around the neck of the statue, and after initial difficulties, the monument was pulled down to the ground. The televised images of the fallen statue, followed by citizens beating its bronze head with shoes and hammers, flashed across the global media as the definitive visual symbol of the end of the dictatorship. Across the capital and in other major cities like Basra and Mosul, decades of accumulated fear, repression, and silence erupted into widespread scenes of celebration, mixed immediately with chaotic episodes of looting, vandalism, and the ransacking of government offices, palaces, and symbols of state power. With the fall of Baghdad, Saddam Hussein vanished into the shadows, transitioning instantly from an omnipotent dictator into a fugitive hunted by the world's most sophisticated intelligence apparatus. Recognizing that conventional command had evaporated, Saddam shed his military uniforms and presidential trappings, adopting the disguise of a common civilian. For months, he moved secretly through the Sunni Triangle, relying on a trusted network of loyalists, tribal connections, and safe houses in areas such as Tikrit, Samarra, and Ramadi. He traveled by car, switched locations frequently, and avoided modern electronic communications to prevent coalition signals intelligence from tracking his movements. During these months in hiding, while his sons Uday and Qusay were tracked down and killed in a fierce 4-hour firefight with U.S. troops in a villa in Mosul in July 2003, Saddam remained an elusive ghost, occasionally releasing audio cassette tapes to urge his followers to continue the insurgency and resist the occupation. The manhunt for the ousted dictator became an exhaustive, meticulous intelligence operation led by elite U.S. Special Operations Forces working in tandem with the Central Intelligence Agency and local informants. By December 2003, patience and relentless interrogation of captured regime loyalists began to yield actionable intelligence regarding Saddam's whereabouts. Investigators narrowed their focus to the rural farming region of Ad-Dawar, near his hometown of Tikrit, where a network of sympathizers was actively supporting and hiding him. On December 13, 2003, coalition forces launched Operation Red Dawn, a coordinated military sweep involving hundreds of troops. Troops converged on a modest farm compound consisting of a brick-and-mud house, a dilapidated shack, and an adjacent date palm grove. Initially, the search of the main buildings revealed nothing unusual. However, a meticulous secondary search uncovered a cleverly concealed and camouflaged spider hole, a small, brick-lined underground bunker situated just feet from the farmhouse, covered by a metal plate, dirt, and foam insulation, with a small pipe providing oxygen. When a soldier lifted the cover and pointed a flashlight into the dark recess, the man hiding inside looked up. With a disheveled white beard, tangled hair, and a look of absolute resignation, the former master of Iraq raised his hands and surrendered without firing a shot. As he was pulled from the hole, reportedly muttering in Arabic, "I am Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, and I want to negotiate," he was checked by a military medic and quickly flown to a secure coalition detention facility. The capture of the Butcher of Baghdad, broadcast on television screens worldwide, with footage of the captive dictator being medically examined, marked the profound, symbolic end of an era of terror and authoritarian rule, closing the chapter on his absolute tyranny and paving the way for a reckoning before an Iraqi court. The capture of Saddam Hussein in a squalid underground bunker near Tikrit marked the definitive end of his physical escape, but it opened a profoundly complex and turbulent final chapter for Iraq, the Middle East, and international jurisprudence. For over 30 years, the Iraqi people had lived under a regime defined by absolute fear, systematic torture, aggressive warfare, and a pervasive cult of personality. Now, the man once known as the absolute master of Baghdad found himself stripped of all power, facing the ultimate reckoning before a court of law. Yet, the transition from dictatorship to accountability was neither simple nor peaceful, as the nation he left behind struggled to heal amid a rising insurgency, deep sectarian divisions, and the heavy burdens of foreign occupation. Following his capture in December 2003, Saddam was held as a high-value prisoner of war by coalition forces at Camp Cropper near Baghdad International Airport. During this period of detention, investigators methodically interrogated him regarding past war crimes, suppression campaigns, financial corruption, and state secrets, while international legal experts and Iraqi authorities worked to establish a tribunal capable of trying a former head of state. The result was the creation of the Iraqi Special Tribunal, later renamed the Supreme Iraqi Criminal Tribunal. This court was specifically established to prosecute Iraqi nationals accused of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and other serious violations committed between 1968 and 2003, while international human rights organizations and legal scholars debated whether a court operating in a war-torn country under foreign occupation could deliver truly impartial justice. Iraqi leaders insisted that the former dictator must be tried by the people he had terrorized for decades. The legal proceedings against Saddam Hussein and several of his top-ranking associates were structured around a series of distinct trials rather than a single massive proceeding, allowing prosecutors to focus on specific, well-documented atrocities. The first trial, which began in October 2005, focused on the Dujail massacre of 1982. Following an assassination attempt against him in the predominantly Shia town of Dujail, Saddam had ordered the systematic reprisal against the local population. Security forces arrested hundreds of men, women, and children, subjected them to severe torture, and executed over 140 individuals without trial, while razing vast agricultural lands to ruin. Throughout the courtroom proceedings, Saddam adopted a defiant, combative posture. He refused to recognize the legitimacy of the court, frequently interrupting the judges, arguing with prosecutors, shouting political slogans, and demanding to be treated as the constitutional president of Iraq. Despite his attempts to turn the courtroom into a political theater, the evidence presented by prosecutors, including signed execution orders bearing his distinct signature, was overwhelming. On November 5, 2006, the tribunal delivered its verdict in the Dujal trial. The presiding judge found Saddam Hussein guilty of crimes against humanity, specifically willful killing, illegal imprisonment, torture, and forced deportation. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The verdict was met with explosive reactions across the globe and within Iraq. In Shia-majority neighborhoods and Kurdish regions that had suffered immensely under his rule, thousands poured into the streets in jubilant celebration, viewing the sentence as historic justice long overdue. Conversely, in sunny strongholds such as Tikrit and parts of the western provinces, the verdict sparked protests, outrage, and deep bitterness, underscoring the severe sectarian fractures that had been unleashed or exacerbated by the fall of the regime. An automatic appellate review upheld the conviction and the death sentence in late December 2006, ruling that the punishment must be carried out swiftly. Before the sentence for the Dujal case could be fully processed, a second major trial was already underway regarding the Anfal campaign of 1987 to 1988, a military operation directed against the Kurdish population of northern Iraq. Led by his cousin Ali Hassan al-Majid, infamously dubbed Chemical Ali. The campaign involved the systematic destruction of thousands of villages, the forced displacement of rural populations into concentration camps, and the widespread use of chemical weapons, including mustard gas and nerve agents, against civilian targets. The most devastating manifestation of this campaign was the Halabja chemical attack in March 1988, which killed an estimated 5,000 Kurdish civilians in a matter of hours. While the Anfal trial continued briefly after Saddam's death against remaining defendants, the primary target had already faced his ultimate judgment. In the pre-dawn hours of December 30, 2006, coinciding with the first day of the Islamic holiday of Eid al-Adha, Saddam Hussein was transferred by U.S. military forces to Iraqi custody at a secure facility in northern Baghdad, formerly operated by the Military Intelligence Directorate. Ironically, the very institution that had orchestrated years of domestic repression. The execution was conducted quickly and secretly to prevent potential insurgent attacks or attempts at rescue. As he stood on the gallows with a black scarf around his neck, witnesses reported that he remained composed and defiant, rejecting a hood and attempting to recite Islamic prayers as the trapdoor opened. The execution was captured on a grainy mobile phone video by a witness, which quickly leaked and was broadcast globally, sparking intense controversy over the dignity of the proceedings, the unseemly sectarian taunts hurled at him by guards in his final moments, and the ethics of state-sanctioned capital punishment. The immediate aftermath of his death did not bring the closure or stability that many had hoped for. Instead, Iraq plunged deeper into a catastrophic sectarian civil war between Sunni and Shia militias, fueled by the vacuum left by the collapse of the centralized Ba'athist state, foreign interference, and simmering historical grievances. Insurgent groups, some consisting of former Ba'athist military officers and intelligence operatives who transitioned into underground guerrilla fighters, launched relentless attacks against coalition forces and emerging Iraqi security institutions. The country experienced years of horrific car bombings, targeted assassinations, and ethnic cleansing that displaced millions of citizens and cost countless lives. Looking back across the sweep of history, the legacy of Saddam Hussein remains one of the darkest chapters of the modern Middle East. His rise from an impoverished background near Tikrit to absolute dictatorship demonstrated how ruthless ambition, disciplined organization, and an unyielding willingness to embrace violence could subvert an entire nation. He transformed Iraq from a country with significant economic potential, modernization, and regional influence into an impoverished, isolated, and broken state defined by ruinous wars, international sanctions, mass graves, and unrelenting terror. His obsession with military dominance led to the catastrophic 8-year war with Iran and the disastrous invasion of Kuwait, both of which drained the nation's wealth and sowed endless geopolitical instability. Yet, the complex legacy of his rule extends far beyond the borders of Iraq. The 2003 invasion that toppled his regime fundamentally redrew the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, altering the regional balance of power, diminishing Western moral authority through the subsequent insurgency and counterinsurgency struggles, and serving as a cautionary tale regarding regime change, intelligence failures, and the violent aftermath of authoritarian collapse. For the Iraqi people, the ghost of the dictatorship lingered for generations, embedded in the physical scars of war, the sorrow of families who lost loved ones to the secret police and mass graves, and the ongoing struggle to build a stable, inclusive, and democratic society upon the ruins of tyranny. Ultimately, the fall, trial, and execution of Saddam Hussein closed the book on an era of absolute tyranny, but left behind a heavy, enduring reminder of the high price of freedom and the profound difficulty of